We're high above the Sea of Galilee up on Mount Arbel. This is in the Bible called the mountain. There are many mountains and hillsides that Jesus spoke on, but in three very special occasions, it's called the mountain. It's almost like it was a mountain that everyone would have known what he was talking about. When you come to the Sea of Galilee, where we're sitting right now, is the most noticeable bit of the geography. It's a cliff that rises 1,200 feet straight up from the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Up here, you can see the entire circumference of the Sea of Galilee. And it's up here that three very special events in the life of Christ took place. We've come to Galilee to look at who Jesus was. We find he's the one that behind me at Kersey was able to command the destiny of the demonized man and liberate him from the bondage to all the legion of demons. Right at the foot of this mountain, directly below me, is the city of Magdala, and that's where Jesus forever transformed Mary Magdalene's life. He liberated her from 7 demons and from a life of wickedness, and she spent the rest of the next 3 years following him everywhere he went, providing for his needs. She was the last one at the foot of the cross as Jesus died, and she's the first one at the tomb. All of these cities show us who Jesus was. But up here on Arbel, the 3 events that are most memorable in Christ's ministry is, it said that Jesus went up to the mountain to pray, and then he chose his 12 disciples. This is the spot where Jesus, looking at the Sea of Galilee behind me, knew those men that he needed to call to be with him. He knew those men that he needed to train to take the gospel onward. The second event takes place up in this region when Jesus was feeding the 5,000. Down below on the plains beneath us, a large crowd of 5,000 men plus their families had gathered. It says in Matthew 14 that Jesus said, we need to feed them. And you know the story of the feeding the 5,000. They only had a small little lunch in a basket, and from those 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus multiplied the food to feed 5,000. Then, as it says, evening was coming, which is 6 p.m., Jesus said, send them away, and he sent the disciples to go out across the sea in the boat. He said, I'll catch up with you. They thought, oh, he's going to walk around the lake and we'll meet him at Capernaum. And so the disciples, it says in verse 23, when Jesus sent the multitudes away, Matthew 14:23, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And evening came. Evening in time reckoning in the Bible is 6 p.m. So at 6 p.m., Jesus sent the multitudes back to their homes. Jesus sent the disciples out onto the lake. And Jesus himself, it says, came up on the mountain where we are. What was Jesus doing? Well, it says in verse 24, he was watching. Jesus watched from 6 p.m. on as out in the distance the disciples were in a boat. And he watched the storm develop. And it says the boat was now in the middle of the sea. So think all the way out in the middle, out there behind me, tossed by the waves, the wind was contrary. What time was that? 6 p.m. Now listen to the next verse, verse 25. Now in the 4th watch of the night. The first watch was from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. The second watch was from 9 p.m. to midnight. The third watch was from midnight to 3 a.m. What does verse 25 say in Matthew 14 if you're following along in your Bible? In the 4th watch. That's from 3 a.m. onward. Those disciples had been out there in a storm for as much as 9 hours. Imagine being in a small boat with a low keel, with waves washing over it, bailing the water out in the blackness of night, and big waves coming towards you, and thinking you're going to drown, and wondering why Jesus sent you out into the lake. And then verse 26, and Jesus went to them from right up here where we are. He was on this mountain. He was watching them. And it says Jesus went down to the coast and walked across the waves. And verse 26 says, when the disciples saw him walking on the waves, they were troubled, thinking it was a ghost. And so they cried out for fear. And the word cry, kradzo, means they screamed. I mean, they were scared, they were drowning, and it was worse to see a ghost coming toward them. They couldn't imagine what kind of a creature could walk across a storm on top of the water. And it says, but immediately through the storm, Jesus spoke to them and said, it is I, stop fearing. What's the lesson from Mount Arbel for us? Well, Jesus isn't on this mountain anymore. He's actually in heaven, but he's still watching. He can see as well from heaven as he could from the mountain. Jesus knew right where they were in the storm, in the dark, in the middle of the night, after 9 hours. He knew exactly where their boat was. He was the master of the ocean and the winds and the waves and the storms. He did not let the storm sink their boat. He only let them get to a place where they were helpless. Jesus likes us to get to places where we're helpless, where we have nowhere else to turn, nowhere else to look but up. We've exhausted our strength, our wisdom, our resources, our plans, and we cry out to him. What happens next? Immediately, Jesus said, it is I, stop fearing. And Peter said, Lord, if it's you, let me come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. And when Peter came down out of the boat, he walked to Jesus on the water. Now we've got Jesus on the water. We've got Peter on the water. We've got the disciples in the storm, still half afraid, watching in wonder as Jesus stands on the water and Peter walks on the water. But then it says, Peter, when he looked around, seeing the boisterous wind and waves, again feared. Momentarily, Peter stopped fearing, and by faith he walked across the water. But when he looked away from Christ and put his eyes on the storm, when he looked away from Christ and saw all the storm surrounding him and the waves, he began to sink back into fear. And Jesus, it says, when Peter cried out, Lord, save me, immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him. Did you know, not only is Jesus in heaven watching us like he was on the mountain, Jesus is right next to us as we sink into our fears. And his arm is ready to reach out to us if we, like Peter, say, Lord, save me. What's the lesson? God allows trials. What's another lesson? Jesus wants to reach out to me. He knows I'm so prone to fear. He knows that storms always make me take my eyes off him. But what he wants is for me to cry out, Lord, save me. And he wants to reach out and rescue me in the storm. There's one last event. Remember, Jesus prayed here before he chose his apostles. Number 2, he prayed here before he rescued them in the boat sinking. What's the third and final event up here? Maybe it's the most important. After the resurrection, Jesus met them down in Jerusalem, about 90 miles from here. They were in the upper room. The doors were shut. He walked through. He talked to them. When he finished, he says, now, I'll go before you. Meet me on the mountain. That's Matthew 28. He said, meet me on the mountain in Galilee. And they came up here, walking up from Jerusalem, coming up on this mountain, and there he was. And do you remember what he said to them? Let me read to you the most precious words for any of us who love and want to serve the Lord. And the 11 disciples went away into Galilee, I'm in Matthew 28, verse 16, to the mountain which Jesus had appointed for them. That's right where we're sitting right now. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some still doubted. And Jesus spoke to them and said, all authority is given to me in heaven and earth. Go therefore, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. This is the mountain of the Great Commission. This is where the church went forth in the power of the gospel around the world from this mountain. But Jesus was working with disciples that even in verse 17 still doubted. You see, we're still fearful, weak humans. We're not God. We are not Jesus. We're just his servants. But he lives within us. And he says, don't fear. When you fear, you sink. Just trust me through your fears, through your storms, through your doubts. Lo, I'm with you always. Up here on Arbel, 3 big events. Jesus praying before he picked him, Jesus praying when he rescued him, and then the final time, Jesus saying, I'm going to pray for you your whole life. I'm always going to be an arm's length away. All you have to do is cry out to me, and I'll reach out and rescue you. Jesus watching me, not any longer from this mountain, but from heaven. Jesus reaching out to each of us when we say, Lord, save me. He will. What lessons from the life of Christ right here on Mount Arbel, just above the Sea of Galilee.